As Donald Trump restarts his Iran fiasco, further humiliation is assured. Once again, clapped-out generals and crackpot politicians are on the airwaves, proposing insane plans to invade all or parts of Iran. Just over 85 years ago, Hitler's Germany was considering a less risky proposition, Operation Sea Lion, an invasion of Britain. Yet the German dictator, not renowned for being cautious or restrained, decided the operation was a risk too far. History has largely focused on the Battle of Britain as being the decisive factor in dooming German invasion plans, and in many ways, it was. The RAF seemed hopelessly outnumbered in the face of the Luftwaffe, but they had some significant advantages. Developing radar meant they knew what was coming and where. The battle was fought on home ground, so while bailed-out Germans became prisoners, shot-down RAF pilots could be up in the air on the same day. Fuel constraints were also an issue. British strategy was excellent. German strategy came up short. And of course, the skill and determination of the RAF played an indispensable part in pulling off what was, by any means, a spectacular upset victory. Yet air supremacy was never the only factor involved in deciding on an invasion of Britain. On an ideological level, Hitler never really wanted an invasion of the country. A professed Anglophile, he had long held the futile dream that the two countries could form an alliance. After the fall of France, he revived the idea, or at least the possibility that a cowed Britain could be persuaded to step aside, in return for some ultimately worthless guarantees about the British Empire. The German High Command was never keen on an invasion of Britain, for practical reasons. If air supremacy was an almost impossible proposition, naval supremacy was a pipe dream. Germany was a continental power, and while its navy was competitive, its surface fleet was no match for Britain's. Nevertheless, once the Channel ports fell with France's June 1940 defeat, plans began to be drawn up. Hitler's Directive No. 9 on the 29th of November 1939 already ordered a blockade of England's Channel ports, an essential prerequisite for any invasion. After consultation between the services, an initial plan envisaged 100,000 paratroopers landing in East Anglia, but required the defeat of both the British Home Fleet and RAF, otherwise the invasion force would be sitting ducks. Goering was particularly dismissive of this original plan. The Navy, fresh from a bruising campaign in Norway, were also resolutely opposed. On the 13th of July, Hitler was briefed by members of the High Command at Berchtesgaden on Operation Sea Lion, but seemed to show little interest. Directive 16 was issued, ordering continuation of preparations, as much as anything to try and heap more pressure on the British. At a further meeting with top brass on the 17th of July, Hitler ruminated that the British were near to collapse anyway, while Admiral Raeder of the Navy complained that the heavy onus on them in the plans were a set of requirements that could not be met. Despite Goering believing the plan to be rubbish, he was still interested in destroying the RAF, and confirmed that the Luftwaffe could do their part from August onwards. Hitler ultimately decided on an each-way bet. If the Luftwaffe could do their part, then the prospects would look a lot more appealing. Directive 17 was issued, intensified action against England, with a view to a final conquest. Then came the Battle of Britain, and with failure at the first hurdle, the operation was formally postponed on the 12th of October 1940. So what if the Battle of Britain had gone the other way, and an invasion commenced? Historians, and pretty much everyone else, agree that it could only have been a complete disaster. Goering was initially confident that the Battle of Britain could be won, but even that would not have given air supremacy. Well-protected factories would have continued producing aircraft, so the invasion force would still have encountered problems from the air. Much of that force, heaving around in barges in the rough autumn seas of the Channel, would likely have been blown up long before they ever got anywhere near England. The German Navy would have been by far the weakest link in the operation, though not for any reason of incompetence. They simply weren't set up for amphibious operations. Forced to refigure commercial barges in the absence of any landing craft, the invasion force would have struggled to even get across the channel. Of around 1,500 barges, half had no power and would have to be towed. They would have to then turn around and run the gauntlet to pick up more forces. Assuming losses on the way, a diminished landing force would not have been properly supplied once the Royal Navy had engaged them. Despite overseas commitments, the British Home Fleet still vastly outnumbered the Germans. Heavy equipment could only be landed after the invasion force, and likely only if a major port was captured. The chances of the whole thing working were almost zero. The Wehrmacht plan required a wide front to land as many troops as possible, leaving them vulnerable not only to supply problems, but also to being cut off from each other. Tidal variations meant some troops would have to land 6 hours after others. Surprise or blitzkrieg would be impossible. 2 British armoured divisions were near enough to the invasion sites to plough through the invaders before panzers could even arrive. The British had had continual warnings of invasion from the Germans, giving them ample time to prepare. A complex system of suicide squads, known as auxiliary units, and advanced intelligence networks were already in existence and would have made conquest a nightmare for a German force also trying to battle the British regular army. Under Operation Lena, German agents were sent to Britain in preparation for the attack, but were either captured or turned themselves over to MI5. False intelligence came back, which was worse than none at all. German naval historian Vice Admiral Kurt Asman wrote in 1958 that the invasion, quote, would have been smashed, while Winston Churchill wrote, quote, had the Germans possessed in 1940 the well-trained and equipped amphibious forces, their task would still have been a forlorn hope in the face of our sea and air power. A small group of historians, such as Robert Forzik, claim that the Wehrmacht would have made it onto the beaches, but would have been stalled and ultimately wiped out if they didn't surrender. It has also been claimed that if the Germans waited until landing craft and other advances were available, say late 1941 or 1942, there would have been a chance of success. However, by this point, all concentration was on the Russian campaign. It should also be noted that by 1942, the Home Guard, much derided not least in the TV comedy series Dad's Army, was by that point in the war a serious fighting force. Current weaponry was on hand, combat and guerrilla training had been given, and they were now mostly in charge of home defence. They would have been no pushover. Operation Sea Lion was wargamed in 1974 by the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. The simulation assumed that the first wave of German forces made it to the beaches in their entirety, which is a mighty assumption. It also assumed disorganisation amongst British forces, which is not suggested by the historical record. Even allowing for this, the simulation concluded with the German forces being forced to surrender after 6 days. It's easy to see why the Wehrmacht and Navy reportedly breathed a collective sigh of relief when the invasion was postponed and never mentioned again.